Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here, and I'm finally back with another build video. It's been about 5 months since my last release, which was the Wildcat, and I've been incredibly busy throughout that time. However, I'm glad to present today's full build of the IBG Models Fw190D-9, a fantastic looking kit on the face of it, so I hope you find this build interesting. Without further ado, let's get into the box and get started with this kit. Enjoy! It doesn't feel like it, but it's actually been 3 years since this kit was originally released, as of recording this video. However, it still features the full deal that we've grown accustomed to with IBG. The instructions are very nicely printed onto glossy paper in full colour, and all of the plastic parts are packed nicely into their own plastic bags to avoid contact and scratching with one another. This kit also includes a nicely printed decal sheet, along with the very handy photo-etched fret, which is always nice to see. Taking a closer look at the parts now, we can really start to notice the key selling point of this kit. The surface detail is absolutely astounding. Not a single rivet has gone missing in this kit, and all the panel lines and surface features are crisp and in scale, all contributing to the overall look of the model. Even Eduard's 190 fails to match the detail of this offering. Being a relatively new tooling, as I mentioned, there's absolutely no flash anywhere on these parts, and from what I could tell, the seam lines were also really subdued and required minimal cleanup later on down the line, which really aids in the enjoyment of building a kit for me. The handful of clear parts that were included are also of a very high quality, with no scratches or scuffs that I could find. They're also crystal clear, which is always nice. Despite being well registered, the decals aren't made by Cartograph, and they did seem to have quite a thick cover film. However, we'll have to see how they behave later on. Anyway, enough previews, let's get cracking with this build. Some of you may have noticed earlier that this kit actually includes a full representation of the inverted V12 engine, featured in this variant of the 190, which was a pleasant surprise to me, as you don't often see this in such small kits. Oftentimes, there'll be a minimal representation of the engine. However, I've never seen an inline engine modelled in this much detail straight out of the box, so hats off to IBG. The engine was the first thing to be assembled, using some Tamiya extra thin. It all went together with no problems at all. There are, of course, limitations to what you can mould in plastic, however, so I did add a few wires and cables here and there using 0.1mm lead wire, inserted into pre-drilled holes that I opened up using my handheld pin vise. When it comes to smaller things like this, I tend not to use a Dremel for drilling, as it can very easily melt the surrounding plastic or cause other unwanted damage. With the engine all built up, I moved on to modifying the engine cowlings so that they will actually be able to see the engine in the finished model. Despite modelling the V12 so nicely, IBG doesn't offer an open cowling option right out of the box, so some minor surgery had to be performed to allow for this. I used a combination of a scribing tool, razor saw, and my craft knife in order to separate the cowlings from the surrounding plastic, with the scribe primarily used to deepen the panel lines that then had to be cut through. All in all, this was a pretty easy process, and I think it worked out nicely in the end. One cowling does of course feature an air intake, which had to be reamed out from the inside in order to look in scale. However, this was pretty easy to carry out, making use of a grinding bit attached to my larger Dremel. It ended up working very nicely in the end, with the air intake fitting snugly into the gap that I opened up using my craft knife earlier. Another realism issue that then had to be sorted was the thickness of the cowlings themselves. As they were originally part of the fuselage pieces, they were quite chunky, so I used some relatively low grit sanding sponges in order to reduce this thickness down. These cowlings also don't feature any structural detail on the inside, of course, as that side was never meant to be seen, so this had to be scratch built. 172 is quite a small scale, so in order to replicate the framework, I just used some Tamiya flexible masking tape, which has a little bit more thickness than regular masking tape, cut down in size and superglued in place. So with all of that engine-related stuff ready for painting, I could now move on to constructing the actual cockpit. It's quite a straightforward part of the build, with a lot of the details moulded into the tub already. However, there were a few bits and pieces to add, including those photo-etched seatbelts and the rudder pedals, which gave a nice little boost to the detail and realism. Now, some paint at last, with the first stage being an overall primer coat in order to improve adhesion, and also to unify those photo-etched parts along with the strut details on the inside of the cowlings. My primer of choice has been Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black for a while now, as the smooth surface it provides is absolutely unbeatable in my opinion. Provided you get your thinning ratios correct, you'll never have a bad day with this primer. In my experience, it pairs best with Tamiya retarding thinner or MLT. I then brought out the old reliable Mr. Super Metallic Superfine Silver, which was used to coat the entire engine block ready for finer detail painting later on. Admittedly, this paint works best when sprayed over a glossy undercoat. However, as you can see in the video, it was perfectly acceptable for this occasion, especially given I'll be doing some pretty heavy weathering over the top later on. I then tackled the cowlings, which were painted up in RLM 02, along with the rest of the engine bay and later on the wheel wells. When painting all aspects of the interior, I tried to maximise the benefits of having that black undercoat as much as possible. By first mottling the paint before applying a final blanket pass, I was able to give the colour a little bit more depth before even using multiple tones or shades. The mottling in itself naturally creates areas of light and dark paint, and the final pass blends it all together nicely. You can see this effect take shape here in the cockpit as well, where I made use of RLM 66. I then emphasised the shading in the cockpit and engine bay by lightening the original paint shades with some buff, which is a great way of changing the tone of the colour without washing it out too much. As you can see, it's still a little bit desaturated, but it's not nearly as bad as mixing with pure white. Making use of my Infinity with a 0.15mm nozzle really helped to provide good control in these detailed areas. And with that, the airbrushed interior paint layers were complete, so it was time to move on to some hand-painted stuff, making use of the good old-fashioned hairy stick. This began with the detail painting of the engine block, primarily the areas that had black paint applied to them as suggested by the instructions and online reference images. It's worth noting that at this stage I opted not to paint with a pure black, instead going for a black/grey shade, as oftentimes pure black paints can look far too stark and contrast way too much with the rest of the paint job. The cockpit in the 190 is relatively monotonous, so there wasn't a huge deal to brush paint here. However, the seatbelts did need a lick of paint, for which I mixed up a sort of light beige tone using a few Bieco model colour shades. Now, when it came to applying the instrument panel decals, I reached the first aspect of the kit that I would personally describe as a miss rather than a hit, as the video thumbnail suggests. As I mentioned earlier, the quality of the decals is fine, however the cover film does protrude quite far from the edge of the decal itself, which poses issues in situations like this. I actually ended up having to cut the excess cover film away, and after this the decals worked perfectly fine, but this was slightly disappointing for such a new kit. At least, however, they did conform quite nicely. Then, following a quick matte varnish, it was time for a bit of interior weathering. I kept this stage intentionally brief, as the visibility into these areas would be quite low. However, I did of course go for the good old reliable sepia oil wash, making use of Abteilung 502 shades. If you'd like more info on how I do my washes, feel free to check out my video on the topic. Sticking with the sepia, I then mimicked some oil stains and streaks in areas such as the engine bay bulkhead, where grime was more likely to build up due to leaks and frequent maintenance. This was carried out by simply applying some unthinned sepia oil paint using a small brush and a streaking motion, before bringing out a soft blender brush to soften the effect and make the stains look like part of the paint job. This particular brush, I believe, is a Pro Art, recommended by James over at LPJ Models. The weathering was then finished off with some chips, scratches and scuffs using lightened forms of the original base colours, this time making use of white, as I wanted the scuffs to look like they're reflecting the light differently to the surrounding paint, making them look a little bit brighter and more desaturated. These were applied really carefully and gradually using a superfine brush, rather than a sponge, as I much prefer the control that the small brush offers. And with that, I could begin the final assembly of the cockpit and the engine bay, which involved fitting the instrument panel into place, along with the two centrally mounted guns, which I painted off camera with the same techniques as earlier. Fitting the cockpit tub assembly into the fuselage was a little bit tricky, as the front section had of course been sawn off earlier. However, the fit was good, so this wasn't as hard as it could have been. Just required a little bit of careful manoeuvring and patience. The other fuselage half was then much easier to fix into place, and I must say the seam lines left behind by this were very minimal, which was great to see. One thing that I would bear in mind here is the very delicate connection points used by the engine cradle. The fit here was again very good, but the engine is only secured in place via 4 small pin connections, so I'd be very careful not to knock it off or damage it later down the line, especially if you're doing an open cowling version like me. We come now again, however, to an aspect of the build which was definitely another miss rather than a hit. However, this is really quite a big one. The upper wing surfaces really did not fit at all over the landing gear bays, producing large gaps on the leading edges of the wings as well as at the wing roots. It was really quite weird, as it's almost as if the designers didn't factor in the thickness of the plastic on the top halves of the wings when designing them, causing massive problems when it came to gluing the halves together. This meant that I had to remove a huge amount of plastic from the inside of the wings using a number 10 blade in order to make enough room for the wheel bays beneath. This whole ordeal was really disappointing to see in such a new kit, to be quite honest, and I did speak to a few others that had already built this kit when I came across this issue, and they too had suffered to varying degrees, so it's definitely not a unique problem. I'd definitely be aware of this if you do choose to build this kit in the future. Luckily, shaving off all that plastic did help to a certain extent, and I managed to get the wings in a manageable state. However, there were still gaps that required filling, so it wasn't the end of the job quite yet. Annoyingly, this upper cowling piece that covers the machine guns was also quite reluctant to fit into place without a gap. However, a little bit of minor modification with a scalpel blade sorted that problem out pretty easily. The control surfaces, on the other hand, slotted very nicely into place with no difficulty whatsoever. Now, time to sort out those gaps along the wing roots that I was talking about earlier. Thankfully, as I said, they weren't too extensive after my modifications. However, I did end up needing 2 rounds of filler in order to properly fill them up. All the excess filler was sanded down with a Tamiya sanding sponge, starting from 400 grit, working my way up to 3000 for a nice polished finish. Following this, the canopy along with other required masks could be added, ready for the painting process. This was initiated by spraying the canopy with the interior shade, so that it wouldn't look like a primer from the inside. Then of course, the Mr. Surface of 1500 Black made a reappearance, and the entire model was unified with a lovely smooth coat. As I prime the model, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to all of my channel members here on YouTube for your continued and generous support. It truly means the world, and I appreciate all of you. If you'd like to find out more about what being a channel member entails, feel free to click the link in the description to find out more about the perks available, which include early access videos, photos, and 3D printer file downloads, as well as build updates and much more. Thank you all so much again. Anyway, back to the build. With the model primed, I could move straight onto some lovely colours. starting with a medium blue tone used for the identification band towards the rear of the aircraft. I'm trying out something new here by painting this marking before the paint job, and it did actually turn out quite nicely. As suggested by KekTank over on my Discord, if you paint the markings first, they end up looking much more unified and integrated with the rest of the paint job, as they won't be slightly raised above it, and instead they'll be level with it. It's subtle, but it definitely made a difference. Once painted, it was masked off with some thin Tamiya masking tape for the edges, and some thicker stuff to cover up the middle. When it came to the actual paint job, I started with the underside colour of RLM76, as it's the lightest of the three tones. It will also make it much easier to paint the side demarcation lines and the mottling later on. This process began by blocking out each of the panels separated by the rivet lines, making use of a slightly mottled finish in order to achieve that varied effect that I was talking about earlier on in the video. This is a time-consuming step, however it's the best way in my experience of replicating that stressed skin effect that you see on loads of skin-loaded, manoeuvrable fighter aircraft. Following this, a much more vivid blue tone in the form of blue azure was loaded into the airbrush and sprayed on panels here and there to offer even more variation. Once the final unifying paint layer is sprayed, this effect will result in a much more interesting surface to look at. I found this particularly important for the underside, as it's a single monotonous tone all the way across. That final unifying layer I was talking about was just a slightly more thinned coat of the original RLM76 tone, in order to make it slightly more translucent. Make sure to build up this layer slowly, as you don't want to obscure the work underneath too much. With that work done, and some necessary masking tape applied, the next step was to begin painting the lighter of the two green camo tones, in this case being RLM82, again from AKRC. I can really recommend these paints, especially in this scenario, as they are very accurate to the original RLM tones used by the Luftwaffe during World War II. The same techniques were used here as on the underside, so I won't go into too much detail, as I'm sure you get the gist at this point. All of this work was again carried out with a 0.15mm nozzle, which was especially important when it came to doing these demarcation lines and mottling along the sides, which really required a steady hand to pull off. Luckily, the patterns in this case weren't too complex, so I think I managed to pull off the effect relatively convincingly. However, it's definitely obvious that I'm out of practice with this sort of airbrushing, having not done anything like this in a few years. I believe in fact that the last mottled paint job I pulled off was way back in my previous Eduard 190 build. Or was it the Fw190? I honestly can't remember. At this point, there was still a bit of mottling on the tailplane that had to be done. However, it required me to have the other green colour done and dusted, so that's what I did next, making use of RLM82's twin brother, RLM81. They're very similar greens, however they do work fantastically together, and this is in fact one of my favourite Luftwaffe colour combinations. Aside from the tropical schemes of course, which are absolutely gorgeous. I opted against using masking tape on the wings at this stage, as I wanted the effect to be authentic to how the colours would have been sprayed in real life, but this did mean I had to be extra careful when spraying the demarcation lines between shades. I don't want any nasty overspray. Speaking of overspray, that is something that I really did want to avoid on the tail fin here. Luckily, I reckon I had my technique more dialed down here thanks to a bit of practice along the sides, so I think it came out alright despite my inexperience. So, that mottling wraps up the paint job of this aircraft, meaning I could now reveal the blue identification band around the fuselage once again. As you can see, the effect is subtle, but it definitely does look more integrated into the build. The decals are up next, so call me old-fashioned, but I always like a nice gloss coat before starting these. I know fewer and fewer people are doing this on their models these days, as smooth paint jobs are more than enough to avoid silvering. However, at this point, I just kind of do it out of habit. And I have to admit, I always like seeing what the model looks like in a glossy finish. It really brings out the colour in my opinion. My gloss of choice is GX100, thinned with MLT. And my decal solutions of choice are the classic duo of Microset and Sol. They've not failed me so far. I was interested to see at this stage whether or not the excessive decal film would cause any problems. However, the entire process went very smoothly to my pleasant surprise. And with a few layers of Micro Sol, the decal film was all but unnoticeable. The decals even conformed really nicely into the surface details, almost as if they were cartograph, so this was very nice to see. A combination of tools were used throughout this process to place and position the decals, including tweezers, a brush, a cotton bud, and my trusty fingers. Once the decals had been left to dry for a while, a nice coat of GX114 sealed them into place, protecting them from any potential damage from the weathering stages coming up next. This is an essential step, as white spirit can really damage decals when in high quantities. As per usual, when it comes to aircraft weathering, I started this build off with a good old-fashioned oil wash, following the same formula as I used earlier. I again used Abteilung 502 Sepia as the base shade for this wash, as it offers good contrast with all of the colours present. However, this time I did add a little bit of smoke black, as the RLM81 is quite dark, and I wanted it to be noticeable. This mixture was touched along all of the panel lines bit by bit, making use of a capillary action to help along the process. I didn't brush it onto the rivets intentionally, as this would make the surface look much too dark. However, when it comes to blending the excess wash later on, some diluted colour will get into them, giving them a slightly grimier appearance. Blending of the excess wash was carried out with a white spirit dampened brush, which I cleaned regularly using a kitchen towel in order to remove the excess picked up by the brush. Having the matte base coat at this stage really helps, as the slightly porous surface allows for some fantastic blended effects, which really boosts the model's realism. Some areas also absorb the wash more than others, creating an almost patchy effect which looks quite good in my opinion. With the wash blended and complete, I moved on to a bit of surface damage here and there in the form of chipping, focused largely around the aircraft's wing routes where the most human traffic would occur. You'd have pilots and mechanics all over these areas pretty frequently, so they were very commonly worn out pretty fast. I used a couple of different brightnesses of lightened RLM82 for this stage, as in my opinion it produces a much more effective result than straight up silver. This then brought me onto the third and final weathering stage on this model, which was the addition of smoke and soot stains from the exhaust pipes, as well as the guns on the undersides of the wings. This was carried out with my favourite method for this effect, where I load some black and brown paint into my airbrush and spray them on. In my opinion, this produces a very effective result. Unlike in my usual builds, I opted not to finish the model with a final matte varnish layer, as I quite liked the level of sheen and the surface finish left behind by the oil paint. So I instead left it to cure for a couple of days and then left it at that. All that was left then was to paint up and assemble the final detail bits and pieces, including the landing gear assemblies, which were glamoured up with some Molotov chrome around the shock absorbers. These fitted very nicely into place with a few dabs of superglue in order to maximise their strength. This was also done for the centrally mounted drop tank. The prop was the next to go on, slotting into place with no issues at all, followed by the engine cowlings from earlier, which did require some careful fettling and a healthy amount of CA glue to secure into place. They did, however, set into place successfully. Some struts were then added to keep them open in the form of brass rod, which was later painted red, as I quite liked the dash of colour that it provided. Next came the remaining canopy glass, followed by the removal of all the remaining masking tape, at which point I rendered the build complete, ready for a final presentation. So here it is in all of its glory. I have to say, despite the kit truly living up to the thumbnail's statement of hit and miss, I'm really quite pleased with the way it's come out. It wasn't the most daring build with any groundbreaking techniques or new methods. However, it felt like a good experience with some problems to solve along the way, and I'm glad I persevered with it. The mottling here and there is a little bit dodgy, I'll admit. However, on the whole, I reckon it could have gone a lot worse. Now, would I recommend this kit? Not really, as the Eduard version features a much more enjoyable building experience, but that surface detail is definitely impressive. So if you fancy a challenge, you know what to do. If you give it the time, it builds into a lovely little kit. So that pretty much sums this video up. I really hope you enjoyed this walkthrough and that you managed to take something away from it, even if it was just one small thing. I'll be back with more videos on a fortnightly basis now, as I have some topics sorted out and videos dusted, so I really hope to see you around in the next one. A massive thanks goes out yet again to all of my amazing channel members, and to all of you for sticking around this long. Again, I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care, keep on modelling. Bye!